Camille Ashford's sedan died on a mountain road with no signal, only hours before a meeting that could save her entire company. When a battered pickup truck pulled over, she reluctantly asked its driver, a quiet single father named Evan Calder, for a ride, certain he belonged to a world far beneath her own. She urged him to hurry, checking her watch every few minutes, until he calmly read aloud the address of his own destination. Camille went still. It was the exact address written on the sealed letter in her bag, the same mansion, the same hour, the same impossible summons. Neither of them yet understood that a dead engineer's final wish had quietly bound their fates together, or that the fortune of thousands of families now rested on whether a CEO and a mechanic could learn to trust one another before nightfall. If you enjoy stories about hidden secrets, sudden reversals, and quiet kindness winning out over power, tap subscribe now so you never miss what happens next on this channel. Camille had left the city alone that morning, driving her own car instead of letting her assistant or her driver come along, because the letter she carried demanded absolute discretion. It had arrived on heavy paper, unsigned except for a notary's seal, instructing her to appear at a mansion on Black Pine Road in the small mountain town of Alder Creek before 6 in the evening. She had read it 4 times before deciding to go, sensing that whatever waited there might be the only thing standing between Ashford mobility and total collapse. If she missed the appointment, the letter warned, the negotiating rights to a piece of technology she barely understood would pass to someone else entirely, and she suspected that someone was Sterling Carrington, the man who already held her company's debt in his hands. The drive had gone smoothly through the valley, past orchards turning gold and rivers running high with autumn rain, until the road narrowed and climbed into thinner air where her phone lost its signal completely. Somewhere past a bend lined with birch trees, the dashboard flickered, the engine sputtered, and the sedan rolled to a silent stop on the gravel shoulder as the first drops of rain began to fall. She tried the ignition twice, then 3 times. Each attempt met with nothing but a dull click, and she stepped out into the cold to search under the hood for anything that looked obviously wrong. Nothing did. The wiring looked intact, the battery terminals were clean, and yet the car refused every attempt she made to coax it back to life, as though something inside it had simply decided to stop working at the worst possible moment. Rain soaked through her coat while she paced the shoulder, checking her phone uselessly for bars that never appeared, and for the first time in years Camille Ashford felt the particular helplessness of a person with money and no way to spend it. It was in that moment that headlights swung around the bend, slowing, and an old Ford pickup pulled to a stop behind her sedan, its bed loaded with a battered steel toolbox and coils of rope. The man who climbed out wore a canvas work jacket stained with grease at the cuffs, and he crossed the road without hurrying, glancing once at the sky as if gauging how much daylight remained before he spoke a single word. He introduced himself simply as Evan, said he could take a look if she wanted, and knelt by the open hood without waiting for her to agree. Within a minute he had traced something in the control unit that made him frown, murmuring that the failure did not look like ordinary wear, more like a component had been deliberately tampered with rather than simply worn out. Camille almost laughed at the suggestion, certain that a small-town mechanic could not possibly understand the electronics inside a vehicle that cost more than his truck, his tools, and probably his house combined. When he explained, in plain and unhurried language, exactly which subsystem had failed and why it could not be repaired on the roadside, she realized with quiet irritation that he was almost certainly right. Time was slipping away, the rain was growing heavier, and her carefully guarded appointment now depended entirely on a stranger with grease under his fingernails and an accent that belonged to these mountains rather than any boardroom she had ever known. Swallowing her pride, she asked if he might be willing to drive her somewhere, and Evan checked his watch, admitted he was already running late for an appointment of his own, and then agreed to take her anyway. Camille climbed into the passenger seat of the old pickup, tucking her coat around her knees, unaware that the man beside her held more power over her company's future than anyone sitting on her board of directors. The cab of the truck smelled faintly of engine oil and pine, and Camille found herself glancing at the small details scattered across the dashboard: a child's rain jacket folded on the back seat, a scuffed toolbox wedged behind the passenger footwell, and a chipped mug in the cup holder printed with the words "Best Dad" in faded block letters. She understood without asking that he was raising a child alone, and some old habit of politeness kept her from inquiring further, though the sight softened something in her that she did not entirely welcome. Every few minutes she checked her watch again, unable to stop herself, and finally offered him an amount of money that made his eyebrows lift slightly if he would simply drive faster along the wet mountain curves. Evan declined without heat, saying the road was slick and no meeting in the world was worth risking a crash for, and something in his flat certainty irritated her more than an argument would have. She told him, more sharply than she intended, that he could not possibly understand what it meant to carry responsibility for thousands of people who depended on decisions made in rooms he would never enter. He answered quietly that responsibility was not measured by how many names a person could recite, and the remark landed with an unexpected weight that she chose not to examine too closely. As the truck wound higher into the hills, Camille noticed that Evan spoke about battery architecture and thermal safety systems with a fluency that no ordinary mechanic should possess, correcting a common misconception about charging cycles as casually as another person might remark on the weather. She asked, half joking, where a small-town repairman had picked up knowledge like that, and he only said he had worked in a different field once, before his life changed direction, offering nothing more despite her curious glance. When the truck crested a ridge and her phone finally caught a flickering signal, a message arrived from Graham Blackwell, her chief financial officer, warning her that Sterling Carrington had already arrived at the mansion and was growing impatient. Graham urged her, in the clipped tone he used whenever a crisis threatened the company's balance sheet, to sign whatever terms were placed in front of her rather than risk losing Carrington's cooperation entirely. Evan's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel at the mention of the name Sterling, and though he said nothing, Camille caught the shift and filed it away with the growing suspicion that this quiet stranger was not simply a man who happened to own a truck. She asked him directly where he was headed, and rather than answering in words, Evan reached into the pocket of his work jacket and produced a sealed envelope bearing the same embossed crest she had seen on her own letter that morning, the crest of the Hawthorne family. Camille read the address printed on his envelope aloud, watching his face as she recited the number 1178 on Black Pine Road, and Evan eased his foot off the accelerator as though the coincidence itself required a moment of caution. He asked her to repeat it, and when she did, he pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder, opened his own envelope with careful fingers, and held it out so she could see the matching time, the matching date, and the same unmistakable seal. Camille felt something cold settle in her chest, because the letter that had summoned her here had promised absolute secrecy, describing itself as a private negotiation involving only her and one other party. She immediately suspected that Evan might be working for Sterling Carrington, planted along her route to gather information or perhaps to delay her arrival long enough for someone else to seize the advantage. Evan, sensing her sudden withdrawal, simply handed the envelope across without protest and let her examine it as thoroughly as she wished, offering no defense beyond the evidence itself. The notary's seal matched, the attorney's signature matched, and even the strange verification code printed along the bottom edge matched exactly what she had memorized from her own copy that morning. The only difference she could find was in the wording of their titles. Her letter addressed her as the commercial representative of the estate, while his addressed him as the technical guardian, a designation Camille had never once encountered in decades of reading contracts and legal instruments. Evan admitted he did not recognize the term either, though he confirmed that Silas Hawthorne, the mansion's late owner, had once been his employer, saying little else about the nature of that relationship. The name struck a chord in Camille's memory, and she found herself recalling a joint venture her own father had pursued with Hawthorne Advanced Systems some years earlier, a partnership that had collapsed abruptly amid rumors of a catastrophic engineering failure. She remembered, slowly and with growing unease, that the engineer blamed for that failure had carried the surname Calder, and she turned to study the quiet man beside her with new and uncomfortable clarity. Evan met her gaze without flinching, neither confirming nor denying what she was clearly beginning to piece together, and the silence between them stretched taut as the truck idled on the shoulder. Camille's mind raced toward the worst possibility, that this man had spent 6 years nursing a grievance and had somehow orchestrated this entire encounter to exact some quiet form of revenge against the company that had once destroyed his reputation. Evan seemed to read the accusation forming behind her eyes, and he told her plainly that he had not come here for her, and he did not want a cent from Ashford Mobility, only an answer to the question of why Silas Hawthorne had summoned him back after 6 years of silence. Something in the steadiness of his voice made her believe him, at least enough to let the accusation die unspoken, and she settled back into her seat as the truck rolled forward again toward whatever waited at the top of the hill. Ahead of them, through a curtain of thinning rain, the iron gates of the Hawthorne estate finally came into view, flanked by a row of gleaming vehicles that could only belong to Sterling Carrington's entourage. Evan guided the old pickup through the gates and parked it awkwardly among a fleet of black sedans and polished sport utility vehicles, the truck looking like a farm animal wandering into a horse show. A member of the estate's security staff approached immediately, glancing at the mud-splattered vehicle and assuming without asking that its driver had arrived to deliver a package rather than attend a meeting of any consequence. Camille stepped down first, and the same guard straightened at once, addressing her by her full title and ushering her toward the entrance with the practiced deference reserved for people whose names appeared on quarterly earnings reports. Sterling Carrington emerged onto the portico a moment later, tall and silver-haired, his smile arriving before his words did, and he remarked loudly enough for the gathering staff to hear that he was surprised Camille had chosen such an unusual form of transportation for the occasion. He turned to Evan next, pulling a folded bill from his coat pocket and pressing it toward him, instructing him with casual condescension to park the truck around back where the staff vehicles belonged. Evan did not take the money, and he said simply that he had been invited as well, a claim that made Sterling's smile widen into something closer to amusement than belief. Sterling laughed lightly and suggested to Camille, in a tone meant to sound like friendly concern, that the man was likely attempting to exploit her generosity by inventing some connection to the estate for his own benefit. Camille, still uncertain herself about what Evan's letter truly meant, did not immediately come to his defense, and her silence in that moment sat uneasily in her stomach even as it happened. Graham Blackwell arrived at Sterling's elbow just then, glancing at Evan's face for a long beat before leaning in to murmur something into Sterling's ear that made the older man's expression flicker just once, before smoothing back into practiced calm. Sterling recovered quickly and instructed the security staff to escort Evan off the property, citing the sensitivity of the discussions about to take place inside, and 2 guards began moving toward the truck with quiet efficiency. Evan produced his sealed envelope a second time, but Sterling waved it away, remarking that any document could be forged by someone determined enough to gain entry to a private negotiation. It was at that precise moment that the estate's front doors opened again, and a silver-haired woman in a tailored gray suit stepped out onto the portico, her expression carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She crossed the gravel drive directly toward Evan, extending her hand and introducing herself as Miriam Holt, attorney for the Hawthorne estate, and she announced in a voice that carried easily across the courtyard that the meeting could not proceed without him present. Miriam then turned toward Sterling and, with the same unhurried authority, informed him that the seat at the head of the negotiating table had been reserved specifically for Evan Calder, and that he would need to find another place to sit. The guards who had been moving to escort Evan away froze in place, uncertain now which instruction to follow, while the staff who had laughed quietly at his truck moments earlier fell into an awkward, watchful silence. Camille felt the ground shift beneath her assumptions as she watched the exchange unfold, realizing with growing unease that the man she had almost dismissed as an inconvenient hitchhiker was, in fact, the very reason this gathering existed at all. Sterling's composure cracked for just a heartbeat before he masked it again, and Graham took a half-step backward, as though putting distance between himself and whatever was about to be revealed. Miriam gestured toward the open doors, inviting everyone inside before the light failed completely and the group moved as one into the mansion's entrance hall, footsteps echoing against marble that had witnessed far more secrets than any of them yet understood. Camille caught Evan's eye as they crossed the threshold together, and for the first time since the roadside encounter, she found herself wondering whether the man beside her held far more power over the coming hours than she did. Inside the mansion's library, dark wood shelves rose to a vaulted ceiling, and a long table had already been prepared with folders, a projector, and a single sealed envelope larger than any of the others. Miriam took her position at the head of the room, opened a leather folio, and explained that Silas Hawthorne had recorded a final message before his death, one he had insisted be played only when both designated parties were present together. The lights dimmed, and Silas Hawthorne's voice filled the room from a recording made months earlier, steady despite the illness that had clearly begun to weaken his body by the time he spoke into the camera. He confessed, without preamble, that the breakthrough technology known as Atlas Core, a system capable of transforming energy management across the entire electric vehicle industry, had been built upon software architecture originally designed by Evan Calder. The admission landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Camille glanced sideways to see Evan's jaw tighten, his eyes fixed on the screen rather than on anyone watching him. Silas continued, his voice heavier now, admitting that he had remained silent 6 years earlier when Evan was wrongly blamed for a catastrophic engineering failure, afraid that defending him would cost the company Sterling Carrington's crucial investment. Evan did not react with triumph or relief at hearing the confession he had waited years to receive. Instead, his expression carried only a quiet, exhausted grief for the time that truth had failed to return to him. The recording explained the terms of the will in careful detail. Evan would be granted the role of technical guardian over Atlas Core, holding sole authority over its safety and its engineering integrity, while Camille would be named commercial guardian, entrusted with the responsibility of bringing the technology safely to market, given her demonstrated leadership at Ashford Mobility. Neither guardian could license, sell, or activate the technology without the written agreement of the other, a structural safeguard Silas had designed specifically to prevent any single party from exploiting it alone. If the two of them failed to reach an agreement by noon the following day, ownership of Atlas Core would transfer automatically into a nonprofit research trust, locking the technology away from commercial use for a full decade. Sterling, never one to waste an opening, immediately offered to purchase Evan's guardianship rights outright, naming a figure of $50 million, as though the number alone might settle the matter on the spot. Evan refused without a moment's hesitation, his voice flat and certain, and the refusal seemed to unsettle Sterling more than any counteroffer could have. Camille, meanwhile, felt panic rising beneath her composed exterior. Because her company could not survive a decade locked out of the very technology that might save it, and she found herself resenting Evan for a principle she was not yet sure she understood. She pressed him afterward, asking quietly whether he intended to use his new authority as a weapon of revenge against a company that had never personally wronged him, only inherited a debt of silence from those who came before. Evan told her he would only sign an agreement once Atlas Corp's safety could be proven beyond doubt, and once the truth of what happened 6 years earlier was finally allowed into the light rather than buried under another negotiated silence. Sterling warned, with the practiced gravity of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, that dragging old history into public view could permanently damage Ashford Mobility's reputation at the worst possible moment for its survival. Camille stood caught between two unbearable choices, protecting the company that carried her family's name, or finally correcting an injustice that had quietly poisoned everything built upon it. Miriam, watching the tension settle over the room, stepped forward and placed a small brass key on the table between Evan and Camille, explaining that Silas had left behind a hidden laboratory beneath the mansion. Only the two guardians together, she said, held the authority to enter it, and whatever waited inside would likely decide far more than either of them yet realized. A narrow staircase behind a bookshelf led Evan and Camille down into a laboratory that had clearly been sealed away for years, its air cool and faintly metallic, banks of servers standing dark along one wall. Sterling and Graham were left waiting upstairs under Miriam's watchful supervision, an arrangement neither man seemed pleased about, though neither dared challenge the terms of Silas Hawthorne's own will. At the center of the room sat a working prototype of Atlas Corp, its casing scratched from years of testing, connected to an offline server bank that required a very specific startup sequence to activate. Evan typed that sequence from memory, his fingers moving with the ease of someone recalling a language he had once spoken fluently, and Camille watched, genuinely astonished, as screens flickered to life around them. For the first time since the roadside breakdown, she saw with total clarity that the man beside her was not simply competent but exceptional, someone whose expertise the mechanic's jacket had entirely concealed from view. As the diagnostic systems loaded, Evan noticed an inconsistency buried deep within the core algorithm, a section that had clearly been modified sometime after his departure from Hawthorne Advanced Systems years earlier. The altered code prioritized raw performance over thermal safety margins, shaving fractions of a second off charging times at the cost of a failure rate that would be statistically small but, across thousands of vehicles, devastatingly real. Camille recognized the implications immediately, understanding that this was precisely the streamlined version Sterling had been pressuring her to approve without the usual months of safety certification. The two of them had only until sunrise to complete a full verification of the system before the board meeting that would determine whether Ashford Mobility survived its mounting debts. Camille brought her command of production timelines and market data to the work, while Evan carried the deep technical fluency needed to trace every altered parameter back to its origin. They argued more than once over methodology, Camille pushing for speed, and Evan refusing to cut any corner that might endanger a single driver. Yet gradually, each began to recognize real value in what the other offered. In a quieter moment, Camille admitted the company had barely 6 weeks of operating capital left, a confession she had not made even to most of her own board members. Evan, in turn, spoke briefly of losing his home, his career, and his reputation after the accusation 6 years earlier, and said only that he refused to let another family pay the price for decisions made by people who would never feel the consequences themselves. Deep within an archived log file, buried among thousands of routine entries, Evan finally found what he had spent 6 years unable to prove: an electronic signature belonging to Graham Blackwell, attached to the very code modification that had once destroyed his career. Evan turned the screen toward Camille and walked her through the timestamp, showing how Graham's credentials had been used to approve the fatal alteration before quietly rerouting the blame onto an account registered under Evan's own name. The evidence was compelling, yet a portion of the surrounding data remained encrypted, leaving the discovery persuasive, but not yet strong enough to stand entirely on its own in a legal setting. Camille found herself reluctant to accept what the screen was telling her, since Graham had worked beside her family for 12 years, present at every crisis, every celebration, every quiet late night when the company's future had felt uncertain. Evan reminded her gently that loyalty could never be measured by a title or a length of service, only by what a person actually did when no one else was watching. Rather than confronting Graham immediately, Camille summoned him down to the laboratory under the pretense of reviewing routine financial figures, careful not to reveal what she and Evan had uncovered. Graham denied everything the moment suspicion entered his voice, insisting instead that Evan had fabricated the records himself in an elaborate attempt to extort money from the company. Sterling arrived moments later, drawn by some instinct for trouble, and immediately declared that Evan had every reason to want revenge against the man who had once employed him, framing the accusation as motive rather than truth. Together, the two men attempted to drive a wedge between Camille and Evan, each offering her a different version of safety if only she would abandon the guardian standing beside her. Sterling proposed privately that if Camille removed Evan from the negotiation entirely, Carrington Dominion Partners would extend the company's crushing debt by another full year, a lifeline dressed up as generosity. Graham, working a separate angle, quietly handed her a prepared document that would place full personal liability for any future failure of Atlas Corp onto Evan alone, absolving both the company and its financial officer of responsibility. Camille read the document slowly, and something inside her hardened as she recognized the pattern repeating itself exactly as it had 6 years earlier: powerful men preparing to sacrifice an innocent man to protect their own interests. She set the pen down without signing, and for the first time since stepping off the mountain road, she stood openly and unmistakably on Evan's side of the room. Sterling's expression cooled instantly, and he announced that Carrington Dominion Partners would begin withdrawing every line of credit extended to Ashford Mobility first thing the following morning, a threat that could unravel the company within days. The weight of thousands of jobs now rested visibly on Camille's shoulders, and Evan told her quietly that she was free to step back from this fight, that he would carry no resentment toward her if she chose the safer path. Camille answered that saving a company by burying a lie beneath it would only delay its collapse, not prevent it, and that she had watched enough businesses hollow themselves out from the inside to know the difference. When the two of them returned to the laboratory a short while later, intending to secure the evidence they had uncovered, they found every server dark and the small drive containing Graham's incriminating records gone without a trace. The mansion's power had failed only in one isolated section, leaving the rest of the building fully lit, a detail Evan noticed immediately and found impossible to explain as simple coincidence. He traced the outage to a deliberate cut somewhere near the laboratory's own circuit, the kind of precise interruption that required knowledge of the building rather than luck or accident. Sterling seized on the disruption at once, arguing loudly that the failure proved Evan lacked the competence necessary to be trusted with something as valuable as Atlas Core. Miriam responded by ordering the estate's gates sealed and instructing every guest to remain inside until the circumstances surrounding the outage could be properly understood. Camille remembered, with a chill, that her own sedan had failed on the mountain road in almost exactly the same manner, its systems dying without any visible mechanical cause. The two failures carried an identical signature, the kind of clean, invisible sabotage that left no obvious fingerprints for an ordinary investigator to find. Evan examined a nearby control panel and discovered a small jamming device tucked behind an access panel, deliberately hidden where casual inspection would never reveal it. The hallway cameras nearest the laboratory had gone dark for exactly 7 minutes. A window narrow enough to seem incidental but precise enough to feel intentional. Graham claimed he had been on a private telephone call during that exact window, but when pressed for any confirmation, he produced no call log, no witness, and no explanation that satisfied the room. Rather than confronting him directly a second time, Evan quietly examined the leather case Graham had carried with him from the moment he arrived, moving with the same unhurried patience he had shown throughout the entire evening. Camille, meanwhile, used her authority as chief executive to access Graham's corporate financial accounts remotely, uncovering a long trail of payments routed through a shell company tied directly back to Carrington Dominion Partners. When Graham attempted to leave the estate under the pretense of an urgent family matter, Miriam stopped him at the door, citing an asset preservation clause written into the terms of Silas Hawthorne's estate. It was Evan who ultimately located the missing drive, not inside Graham's case at all, but hidden within a battery compartment in Sterling Carrington's own vehicle parked outside. Sterling insisted immediately that someone had planted the evidence to frame him, his composure slipping for the first time since the group had gathered that afternoon. Evan explained, calmly and without triumph, that whoever had taken the drive could not have known it carried a small backup transmitter, a safeguard he had built into every sensitive device years before he ever imagined needing it again. The signal from that transmitter led directly and unmistakably to the vehicle now sitting in Sterling's own private parking space. Camille finally understood the full shape of what had happened to her that afternoon, that her own car had been deliberately disabled to make her miss the meeting entirely, clearing the way for Sterling to claim Atlas Core without any resistance at all. Once the drive's contents were restored, one final audio file remained buried among the corrupted data, and its contents involved a conversation Camille never expected to hear, one that included her own father's voice. The recording captured a private meeting from 6 years earlier between Silas Hawthorne, Sterling Carrington, Graham Blackwell, and Camille's father, discussing the very engineering failure that had ended Evan's career. Her father's voice, calm and businesslike, made clear that he had known even then that Evan bore no responsibility for what happened, yet he agreed to let the blame stand rather than jeopardize a critical investment partnership. Evan listened to the recording with visible stillness, his hands folded on the table, betraying nothing beyond the faint whitening of his knuckles as the truth finally arrived 6 years too late to matter in the way he once needed it to. Camille felt something inside her collapse quietly as she realized that a portion of her own career, her own rise to the position she now held, had been built unknowingly on an injustice done to the very man sitting beside her. She apologized immediately, the words spilling out before she could measure them, but Evan told her gently that an apology could not undo 6 years of a life rebuilt from nothing. Sterling, sensing an opening in her visible guilt, moved quickly to exploit it, warning that if the recording became public, both her family's reputation and Ashford Mobility's already fragile stock price would collapse within days. He offered her an alternative, a quiet path where the recording would simply disappear. The contract would be signed immediately, and the company would be saved before the sun rose over the valley. In exchange, Evan would receive a substantial payment and a private, unpublicized acknowledgement of the wrong done to him, tidy and invisible, exactly the kind of arrangement that had protected these men for years. Evan refused outright, telling Camille plainly that he would not allow the truth of what happened to become another quiet transaction conducted behind closed doors for the comfort of powerful people. Camille asked him directly whether he was willing to let thousands of ordinary employees lose their livelihoods simply to reclaim his own name and reputation. Evan answered that it was Sterling forcing her into that impossible choice, not him, and that framing the decision as his fault was exactly the kind of manipulation that had cost him everything once before. The exchange left them both raw, and for a short while they retreated to separate corners of the mansion, the earlier warmth between them cooling under the strain of the evening's revelations. Camille climbed to an upper floor alone and stared down a printed list of manufacturing plants scheduled for closure if the company's credit line collapsed, each location representing hundreds of families she had never personally met but now felt responsible for. Down in the entrance hall, Evan stepped outside briefly to call his daughter June, keeping his voice light and steady so she would not sense how uncertain the coming hours truly were for her father. Camille, passing nearby, overheard him promise June that he would be home soon, a promise made without any real certainty of what the morning would bring for either of them. Watching him through the doorway, she understood with sudden clarity that this was a man who had lost almost everything more than once, yet still refused every offer to protect himself by harming someone else. She returned to the laboratory a short while later and proposed a third path neither Sterling nor Graham had considered, one that did not require choosing between the truth and the company's survival. They would release the truth publicly, she said, and simultaneously use Atlas Core itself to attract entirely new investment, breaking the company's dependence on Sterling Carrington's financing once and for all. To make the plan real, Camille would have to convince her own board of directors by morning, a board where a majority of votes currently belonged to allies quietly loyal to Sterling Carrington's interests. Camille convened an emergency virtual meeting with the Ashford Mobility Board shortly after sunrise, her exhaustion masked carefully behind the composed voice she had spent years perfecting for exactly this kind of moment. Sterling, joining the call from another room of the estate, spoke first and confidently declared that Camille had failed to secure the guardianship rights necessary to save the company at all. Graham, still attempting to salvage his own position, proposed that the board immediately vote to remove Camille from her role, framing her judgment as compromised by an outsider with no real standing. Several board members openly questioned why the fate of a multi-billion-dollar company should depend in any way on a man who, as far as they understood, repaired vehicles for a living in a small mountain town. Sterling could not resist adding, with a thin smile audible even through the call, that it seemed absurd for anyone to trust the future of Atlas Core to the driver of an aging pickup truck. Evan said nothing in response to the insult, standing quietly beside Camille as the meeting unfolded, his composure unshaken by opinions that had once cost him everything, but no longer held the same power over him. Instead, he presented the safety data methodically, walking the board through exactly how the altered version of Atlas Core would fail under real-world conditions if Sterling's accelerated production timeline were approved without proper testing. One skeptical board member pressed him on his credentials, questioning whether a person with no current corporate title could truly be trusted to evaluate something this consequential. Miriam intervened at that point, presenting the original patents, the employment records, and the explicit terms of Silas Hawthorne's will establishing beyond doubt that Evan was not merely qualified but legally and technically central to the entire technology in question. Camille followed immediately with the financial evidence she and Evan had recovered overnight, laying out in precise detail how Graham had manipulated internal data and deliberately deepened the company's dependence on Sterling's capital. Graham was suspended from his position on the spot, and the board agreed unanimously to notify financial regulators of the irregularities uncovered in his accounts. Sterling, sensing his leverage evaporating in real time, threatened to withdraw his firm's financing immediately, hoping the shock of the threat alone might force the board back into line. Camille answered by unveiling the restructuring plan she and Evan had spent the night preparing, a framework built to survive without depending on Sterling Carrington at all. Atlas Corp would be licensed to Ashford Mobility under the strict safety standards Evan himself had established. A portion of future profits would be directed toward protecting jobs and restoring intellectual property rights, and every line of testing data would undergo independent audit before release. New investors, already quietly approached through Miriam's network, stood ready to commit fresh capital the moment Sterling's controlling influence was removed from the table entirely. The plan received immediate support from Miriam and from a major pension fund with significant holdings in the company, tipping the balance of the room decisively. The board reversed its earlier hesitation and firmly rejected the motion to remove Camille, choosing instead to back the very plan Sterling had dismissed only minutes before. In a matter of minutes, Sterling Carrington lost control over a deal he had spent years quietly engineering behind the scenes. Standing before the full board, Camille declared plainly that the person who had truly saved Ashford Mobility was not a billionaire investor, but the very man they had all mocked for arriving in a truck stained with engine grease. In the days that followed, the full record of what happened 6 years earlier was made public, correcting a story that had been allowed to stand uncontested for far too long. Evan was formally cleared of every allegation once made against him, and his role as the original architect behind Atlas Corp's foundational design was officially and permanently acknowledged. Graham faced a formal investigation into financial fraud and the deliberate sabotage of company data, his once trusted position dissolving under the weight of evidence that could no longer be hidden or explained away. Sterling lost his seat among the company's primary creditors and found himself facing a series of civil lawsuits from shareholders who felt deliberately misled about the true state of the company's finances. None of it required violence or confrontation of any dramatic kind. Only the quiet, grinding machinery of law and consequence finally catching up with people who had assumed themselves untouchable. Camille called a public press conference shortly afterward, standing before cameras to openly acknowledge her own family's role in helping conceal an injustice they had known about for years. The admission cost her a measure of her reputation in the short term, yet within weeks it had earned her something far more durable, the renewed trust of her employees and the public alike. Evan declined every offer of an executive title or a corner office, choosing instead to lead an independent safety council overseeing Atlas Corp's continued development, a role flexible enough to leave him time for June every single evening. He kept his small mobile repair business running exactly as before, unwilling to abandon the modest life he had rebuilt piece by piece after losing everything the first time. Camille drove out to his garage herself to deliver the finalized partnership agreement, arriving this time without an assistant, without a driver, and without the polished armor she usually wore into meetings. She thanked him, quietly and without ceremony, for putting her on a road she had never once imagined she needed to travel until the moment her car broke down beside his. Evan told her, in the same unhurried voice he had used since the day they met, that she alone had decided not to return to the version of the company that had once been comfortable with silence. The late afternoon light slanted low across the gravel lot as they stood together beside his truck, the noise of the highway distant behind them. Before she left, Camille asked, almost hesitantly, whether Evan might be willing to give her one more ride sometime, an offer that carried far more meaning than the simple words suggested. Several months passed, and Ashford Mobility steadied itself enough that not a single manufacturing plant on the original closure list was forced to shut its doors. Atlas Corp cleared every independent safety review with results stronger than even Evan had privately expected, vindicating the very standards he had once nearly lost his career defending. He remained publicly recognized for his contribution, yet chose to keep the same simple rhythm of life he had built for himself in June in the years since his disgrace. Camille grew steadily closer to Evan and his daughter during those months, the friendship deepening slowly and without pressure, built on patience rather than urgency. One afternoon she pulled into his garage in a car that was running perfectly, its engine humming without complaint, and told him honestly that nothing about it was broken today. She simply did not want to make the drive alone, she admitted, and asked instead where he happened to be headed that afternoon. Evan asked in return where she wanted to go, and Camille read him an address she now knew by heart, the same address written on 2 sealed envelopes that had once brought them together as strangers. The old Hawthorne mansion had since been transformed into a research and training center for young engineers, carrying Evan's name above its entrance in simple, unadorned lettering. Evan smiled faintly at the address this time, no longer surprised that their paths were leading to the same destination, only quietly grateful for the reason behind it. He walked around to open the passenger door for her, the same door he had opened once before on a rainy afternoon that neither of them could have predicted would change everything. They pulled out of the garage together as the lights softened over the hills, no longer a chief executive and a stranger with a truck, but 2 people who had chosen deliberately and together to build something more honest than either had known before. The first time Camille Ashford climbed into that old truck, she had no other choice left. The second time, she climbed in because she finally knew exactly who she wanted beside her for the ride ahead.